Having arrived at GW in the ambulance, which was a pretty horrendous journey for me, I was parked in the entrance and left there for a while they decided to put me into a bay or to a ward. I was then pushed into a bay and left for what seemed to me to be a very long time without any information or feedback. I was taken up to Linnet Ward. Again, I was not really told what the ward specialised in or what was going to happen to me. And this time I'm still feeling very poorly. So I was told I was going to have the full works to try and identify why I had a reoccurrence of the sepsis. Head scan, body scan, ultrasound, blood tests, urine tests, just about every test that I can imagine. At 9 o'clock that night I was moved to Kingfisher Ward, unfortunately with no explanation given. Again, disconcerting. I later understand the part of the hospital I was in was used as a day centre. That's the reason for the move. It would have been nice to have been told. But later that afternoon, I was moved again within Kingfisher, again with no explanation given for the move. At 10:30 that evening, I was just drifting off to sleep and was informed that I would probably have to be moved again. I'd already explained that I had been moved 2 or 3 times and I was ready to go to sleep, but I was told that I would probably have to be moved and to be on standby. So 15 minutes later it was confirmed I was going to move, packed up all my stuff. Unfortunately I had to wait an hour for the porters to come along to take me to Neptune. I arrived at Neptune around midnight and of course it was dark. I was pushed into a corner of a ward and greeted, asked if I could walk. I said yes. Was told, good, the toilet's opposite, I have to go. Unfortunately, that was the last I saw of anyone for around half an hour. During that time, I had to put my kit away into a locker, which was obscured by a chair, an armchair, a wheelchair from the adjacent bed. So I was in a very confined space, in a very dark ward. I didn't understand at the time, but of course I subsequently learned that this was an emergency bed space, and unfortunately the bed overhung the doorway. Every time the door opened to the ward, it hit the bed and the bed shook. There was a siren outside of the door, which I understand is a patient call, which seemed to be disproportionately loud for the middle of the night. And there was also a fire door, which continually banged every time someone went up and down the corridor. All in all, a very noisy and a very cramped space. And unfortunately, next to a toilet, which was, let's just say, in need of cleaning. The whole experience by then was beginning to whir in my head. The fact that I couldn't sleep. I was woken when I did start to drift off by a nurse who had to take temperature and blood pressure, etc., which I fully understood. However, I tried desperately to drift off again, couldn't, went to the loo, found the loo in a very, very poor state of hygiene, which concerned me. Went back to bed, did manage, I think, to start to drift off, to receive the tap on the shoulder from a nurse clutching a clipboard, asking me if I'd brought any valuables onto the ward. By now, I am wide awake because the adrenaline is starting to pump. I'm thinking this really could have happened in the morning. So I'm led there with the door banging, with the bed shaking, with the siren outside of the door, in this very confined space, in the dark, not knowing where I was, why I was there, and feeling very vulnerable. Not even sure that the people on the ward knew where I was or even who I was because of the confusion with a patient of a similar name that was moved at the same time. So I'm now beginning to become very anxious, and everything seemed to become clear to me. I didn't know where I was. I didn't know why I was there. Someone had mentioned cancer previously, and I didn't know if I had cancer. I'd had bad experiences with 111 misdirecting me. I'd had a misdiagnosis by a GP. I'd had someone say I was going home tomorrow, but the consultant said I was going to be reviewed tomorrow. So I didn't know what the next steps were. I'd had no feedback on a lot of the tests that had taken place. I had feedback that the urine sample that I brought with me that maybe would have revealed the problem had been lost or couldn't be traced. I'd had a consultant tell me my temperature was okay when in fact I knew it wasn't. I'd found myself in a broom cupboard, and I think the elephant in the room for me was, why is a hospital that millions of pounds have been invested in too small? Why is there all this confusion? Why is there a shortage of equipment? Why are people not telling me what's going on? And it was at that point, I think, that I thought, enough is enough. I cannot sleep here. I'm not going to sleep here. I am not comfortable that everyone is joined up on my case. I think there's going to be a mistake made. I need to do something. And it was at that point I rang the bell and said, what the hell am I doing here? In fairness, everyone wanted to do something. They tried to bring a chair, a relaxer chair, into the family room for me to sleep in, but it wouldn't fit through the door. They offered to move patients around, which I said no. I've already disturbed the ward I've come from at midnight. I've disturbed the ward I've just come into at midnight. You're not moving patients around because I've thrown my toys out of the pram. And there was a great deal of effort that went on to try to accommodate me, but I made it perfectly clear I wasn't going to go back into my broom cupboard, as I called it. And the solution was to put a mattress on the floor of the family room, which is where I slept. And I have to say I slept well for 2 to 3 hours. There was one particular nurse, a sister, Andrea Plum, who came to me in the morning and was only there to introduce herself. She had no idea of the events that had gone on beforehand. And she made me feel like I was very important to her, that she was very, very upset, and she was genuinely upset with what had happened. She couldn't believe the tale of woe that I was spinning, and wanted to make it better and wanted to do something. And I think it was at that point I started to feel that things were going to be put right, and that I was going to feel confident that the treatment I was receiving was appropriate, and that the care that I thought was missing was going to be reinstated. But at 7:30 that night, a nurse came in and told me that I had been discharged. And of course, I'm ready to ring the family and say, come and get me, I'm out of here. But I couldn't go home until the Saturday. And I said, well, why can't I go home until tomorrow? And she said, I don't know. And I thought, well, I'm not entirely happy with this. And I said, well, what happens tomorrow? And she said, well, what will happen is your notes will get sent down to the pharmacy, and the pharmacy will make your drugs up, and they'll come back up at 2 o'clock because it's Saturday and they close at midday. And then once you've got your drugs, you can go home. So I said, well, is that the only thing I'm waiting for then, my drugs? And it would only be an antibiotic anyway. And she said, well, I don't know. And she was very busy, and off she went. And I thought, no, I'm not having this. So I went off and unfortunately, I found my guardian angel, Andrea. She said, no, she said, you are fit to go home, but you do have to have medication. And I said, well, how hard can it be to give me a prescription? I'll go to a chemist and get the prescription. It can only be an antibiotic. She said, well, it is. Half an hour or so later, she came back. She had a box of the medication. The house officer had signed the the discharge, and 9:30 I was home. If I hadn't have done that, I would have been there to at least 2 o'clock the following day. And all the time I'm thinking, this is a perfectly good bed. Somewhere in this hospital, there is someone in an emergency bed. And this is the reason why.